Hello and welcome to this Open Food Conference brought to you by the Flemish government in the context of the Belgian presidency. My name is Natasha Foote. I am a freelance journalist specialised in EU agri-food policy. I had the pleasure not only of opening this event, but also helping to guide the discussions we'll be having over the course of the next 3 days. And I actually think event maybe doesn't quite do it justice. It's more of a agri-food extravaganza. So we have a whole 3 days to dive deep into a full menu of topics, issues, concerns, solutions with a wealth of expert speakers from all across Europe. And that's lucky because there is plenty to talk about. So it's great to see so many of you here today. So I think it's fair to say that the agri-food sector has weathered its fair amount of ups and downs over the past few years, between navigating pandemics and wars, and the sector has also seen the presentation of various initiatives at all levels, from the EU's flagship food policy, the Farm to Fork strategy, to the Flanders food strategy. So it's time to take a moment to pause, breathe, and maybe take stock of the work that was done, or maybe not done, over the past few years, and the lessons we can draw from this, and look ahead also at the future path towards creating a truly sustainable agri-food system. And of course, these conversations fall at a very key moment, not only because the EU elections are just around the corner, but also because it comes on the back of continuing unrest among the farming community. So we've seen the farmers taking to the streets in protest over unfair prices, administrative burden, among other things. So this is the space to have an open dialogue about the future of our food system and create these synergies that are so badly needed between policy, science, industry and practice to offer systemic responses that are needed to tackle the systemic issues and also serve as inspiration for the next EU and national policies. So before we dig in, let me just give you a quick overview of what you can expect over the course of this 3-day event. So each day we'll be kicking off with a plenary session, just like this one, and then we will be digging into various breakout sessions in the afternoons. Now, if you're ever lost, don't worry. You can have a look at the video screens that are in the hallway. They have all the information that you need about where you're supposed to be and when. You can also refer back to the website. So that's the openfoodconference.eu with the program, the timetable of all the thematic sessions. There's also the good old-fashioned way, if you're a technophobe like me, which is nice. You can ask at reception, and they will be able to point you in the right direction. And the same goes for everything to do with transport for site visits. You can find everything you need to know on the website and the screens. And usually at this point, I'd encourage you all to sign up for extra sessions and trips you'd like to attend. But actually, we're at full capacity, which is quite incredible. So for those of you who have registered, enjoy. For those of you who have not, perhaps that's the first lesson to take away from this event, to get in sooner. But there'll be plenty of opportunities to get involved in the discussions. And if you would like to follow along or comment on social media, be sure to use the hashtag #OpenFoodConference. Nice and simple. And so I'm now going to kick off this event with a keynote speech from Timothy Searchinger, who is a senior research scholar at Princeton's Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment, and also a senior fellow and technical director of the food program at the World Resources Institute. So Timothy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I understand that I'm filling in for the minister, so I'm actually going to be junking this and simply issuing directives for the next half an hour while I'm... So thank you very much for having me. This is a very exciting program, and it has lots of exciting ideas, all of which are challenging. But I want to put this in a global context, because what Europe should do with its food system has to track what the world needs to do with its food system. Because climate change is a global challenge. Feeding people is a global challenge. These are a whole bunch of reports that we've put out over the last 5 years, big, thick tomes. So if you want to learn more about things, you can read those reports. And the global context is that we don't have enough land. So we have lost, on average, or we've lost about 25% of, well, it's more than 25. We have put about 25% of the carbon in the atmosphere due to land use change. Half of all the world's vegetated land has been converted to agriculture. That's even more in Europe. We've also lost huge amounts of carbon from the world's forests. And the challenge is that even though we have transformed the planet physically, we need a lot more of virtually everything that we use land for. At least 50% more crops in the next 40 years. We're on a path to demand 70% more meat and milk, at least 50% more wood, and then additional land areas are going to be taken up by urban expansion. We also need more carbon. Virtually every strategy for solving climate change not only assumes that we have stopped clearing land for more agriculture, but that we have reduced our agricultural land area to store more carbon in forests. Now, we are actually on a path to clear vast areas of land. So this is an interesting satellite study that we had a couple of years ago, and it finds that cropland is expanding at a rate of 10 million hectares per year, just annual cropland. Permanent crops like oil palm add another 1 million hectares. That means that in the next 30 years, we're going to clear an area the size of India of good land, carbon storing land, biodiverse land. And that doesn't even count pasture. And that's the net. So all of this stuff in red is where cropland is expanding. But there's actually areas where cropland is declining, including in parts of Europe. And that is another 10 million hectares. So the actual gross expansion is about 20 million hectares. So that's an area, you know, England is about, I think, 12 million hectares of land, something like that. Maybe 14. So we're having enormous expansion and clearing of land, which is contributing 10% per year of the amount of carbon people add to the atmosphere and huge biodiversity effects. But I also want to point out that we're kind of shifting where agriculture is growing. We've had declines in agricultural land in some areas, but increases mainly in the tropics. Okay, so you need more food? You need more carbon storage? Well, one solution might be to make more land, but I don't think we can make more land. You have a fixed area of land. So how do you produce more food and more carbon storage with a fixed area of land? You have to use land more efficiently. The only option. And that means you have to produce more efficiently, you have to produce more food on the same land, and you have to consume more efficiently, which means you have to consume less land-intensive food. So one way to think about it is we have to minimize what we call the land carbon footprint. This is the amount of carbon we lose from native vegetation and soils to produce food. Now, on top of this enormous expansion of agricultural land, we also have production emissions from agriculture. So they're about 6.5 billion tons. So global emissions, about 50 gigatons of CO2. The production emissions, about 6.5 in 2010, 6.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. We predicted that with increased food consumption and production, that would go up to 9 gigatons. And most solutions require that that be down around 4. So you have to produce roughly 2/3 more food with 1/3 of the production emissions. And of course, we have other challenges with agriculture too. So agriculture uses nitrogen. It uses nitrogen because nitrogen is a compound of every protein, which means you need nitrogen to produce more plants. And we lose nitrogen, and of course, one of the big challenges in Europe is the losses of nitrogen and nitrogen deposition. So we kind of summarized the goals with the slogan, produce, protect, reduce, and restore. Produce more food on the same land, protect habitats, reduce land-intensive food production and emissions, and then restore the areas that are least suitable for food production. Now, why do we actually have to produce more food on the same land? Well, let me show you what we predicted. We predicted in this huge study we did for the UN and the World Bank that in 40 years we would clear an area of about 600 million hectares of land. That's twice the size of India. Some of that was cropland, the rest was pasture. And that assumes that we have historic rates of yield growth. Now, if we tried to produce all the food that we're going to need in 2050 with today's farms, you would actually end up clearing more than 3 billion hectares of land. The entire size of the continental US is 800 million hectares of land. You would basically have almost no forest left in the tropics and the temperate zone. So in our projections, we assumed historic yield gains that keep that only to this. And in fact, it also reduces production emissions. Being more efficient in the production of agriculture keeps the production emissions from growing. Without improvements in efficiency, they would have gone up to 11 gigatons, not 9. But we also need to reduce. We need to reduce by having less reliance on land-intensive foods. And above all, that means holding down the increase in growth and demand for meat and milk. Now, I say holding down, and I'll come back to that, because while people in Europe and the US consume huge amounts of meat and milk, most of the people in the world consume very little. And the land use and emissions are much, much higher. So this was a paper in Nature in 2018, and this is kind of an annualized cost, the amount of carbon we lose from land to produce each of these different products, a kilogram of protein from each of these products. And what you see above all is that beef is off the charts. So the production emissions, the methane, nitrous oxide, they're in the dark green, but the real cost is the land use. And to give you an idea of how challenging this is, I want to explain this chart. So on this axis is the population likely to live in each country or region in 2010. And this is in billions, so there'll be almost 10 billion people in 2010. And on the y-axis is the per capita consumption of milk and meat. And what you see is there are going to be more than 6 billion people in 2050 that are in regions where the average consumption of milk and meat is in this red bar, and it averages around 200 kilocalories of milk and meat per person per day. Now in Europe and the US, it's about 800 kilocalories a person per day. And when we do these estimates, we're using FAO projections that this consumption in these poor countries will only go up to about half of the level in the US and Europe. And you know what? They deserve to eat that. In fact, that projection assumes, unfortunately, that people in sub-Saharan Africa will only still be so poor they'll only consume a quarter. So these bars are where we look at targets for reducing milk and meat consumption by the world's wealthiest. And what you see is that even if Europe and the US manage to reduce milk and meat consumption a lot, we're still going to need more milk and meat. So we need to do that. It's critical that we do that. But that doesn't mean we have a surplus of land. That just means we're creating a little more land so that poor people can eat some milk and meat. Now, one thing we can't afford to do is increase our demand for land in very inefficient ways. So unfortunately, what is the single most important land use policy of governments around the world today? It's to increase consumption of biofuels. By far the most dramatic effect. 40% of the increase in demand for vegetable oil globally has been driven by biodiesel. And here's the efficiency of using land to produce biofuels. So if you have 1,000 watts of energy from the sun, today you can convert that into at least 150 watts of electricity using solar panels. If you turn that into ethanol from maize, from corn, you get 1 watt. And even for cellulosic ethanol, in the best location projected in the US, it would be 3.5 watts. And we did a study and showed that on 75% of the world's land, you would get at least 100 times more usable energy using the land, and therefore the sun, to produce solar electricity than you would to produce biofuels. And that becomes 300 to 1, and you put that electricity in a car because electric engines are more efficient than gasoline or diesel engines. So, despite that fact, there are huge projected increases in demand by governments for biofuels, dramatically increasing the demand for land. Okay. So, does Europe have surplus land? There are a lot of calls in Europe and elsewhere for more bioenergy, to reduce yields, to various other things. Does Europe have surplus land? Well, it appears that it does. So this is a wonderful figure put together by, actually it's Fuchs without the E at Wageningen. And it shows the reforestation of Europe over time from 1900. And it looks like Europe has surplus land. But why is Europe reforesting? The US is also somewhat reforested. The short answer is that Europe had deforested so badly by 1900 that it had nowhere to go but up. And one thing that happened was we got rid of horses. And we replaced them with cars and tractors. And that freed up huge amounts of land. Obviously at a huge cost, but it freed up a lot of land. And in Europe, meat consumption went up, but eventually it plateaued. Beef consumption actually went down, which is really good. And the population stabilized. So as long as yields continue to grow, Europe will have land, more land than it needs. It can do something else with its agricultural land. Another reason, however, is Europe has outsourced a fair amount of its food production. So this is a paper I had in Nature a couple years ago. And the red is what we call the land carbon trade deficit for Europe. That is the amount of land that is used abroad to feed Europe. The amount of carbon on an annual basis lost from land to feed Europe. And the blue is the surplus, is the exports. That's the amount of carbon lost from European land on an annual basis to feed other people. But you see, Europe has a deficit. That's a huge deficit. That deficit is equal to all of the carbon gained by regrowing forests in Europe. So Europe has outsourced its food production, some of its food production. And so Europe, and this is true in the US too. So everything I say about Europe is true in the US. We have a joke in the US that says a rich kid was born, he thinks he was born on third base in baseball and hit a triple. And that's the equivalent of saying, you were born in the second half of a football game with a 3-0 lead and you think you're Lionel Messi. But it's just because we were so bad in the past. Now, what does Europe and the US have to do? We still have to produce and reduce. We have to produce more food for other people, stop at least get rid of this trade deficit, and reduce our consumption. So, ironically, we believe that Europe needs to produce even more milk and meat because there's this huge growing demand. But it needs to consume less milk and meat so that its exports at least balance its imports. And then for the land that, it still would have land that's freed up. But that land needs to restore carbon and habitat, not biofuels. So, what is Europe's policy? Unfortunately, the Fit for 55 plan contemplates taking a fifth of Europe's agricultural land, cropland, and turning it into energy crops by 2050. So this is land that wouldn't be able to be restored as habitat, wouldn't produce food for other people. It becomes an energy crop. Why is that? Because European policy views the use of existing agricultural land as free from a carbon perspective. If you divert that land to another use, it's viewed as having no carbon cost, even though what you're doing is outsourcing deforestation. And that's the common policy in the US too. That is what explains biofuels. Why do you think biofuels are good, even though they use so much land so efficiently? It's because you view the land as free. The Fit for 55 policy also contemplates, in the modeling, the conversion of half of Europe's remaining semi-natural grasslands, which are the most biologically diverse agricultural lands in Europe. What should Europe's policy be? Okay, here's the other challenge with Europe. So Europe now, I had a paper, I was the lead author of a paper for the World Bank on reforming agricultural subsidies. And Europe spends more than $90 billion a year on agricultural income support. And this is the amount that goes towards something related to the environment. The amount that goes toward addressing climate change is so small you can barely notice it. $94 billion per year, almost nothing for that. So what should Europe's policy be? Well, stop outsourcing your food production. As I said, actually export more milk and meat, produce more milk and meat while consuming less. Consuming less, then restore some forests and above all the drained peatlands. So drained peatlands are, we probably know they're responsible for 100 to 200 million tons of CO2 emissions per year in Europe. That needs to be restored. And a lot of what your conference is about all the innovations that are possible in agriculture. And these are just some that I focus, but it's making more plant-based meats. It's finding a way to get high-quality feed from grasses. This is something going on in Denmark that converts grasses into a high-protein feed and a higher quality grass. Some way to reduce the emissions from cattle. This is algae. Biological nitrification inhibition is a way of having, it's a breeding into crops, and there is now in a wheat variety, a property where the chemicals, the roots themselves exude a chemical that keeps nitrogen in place, reduces the nitrogen losses, reduces the nitrogen that turns into nitrous oxide. And you have lots of things covered in this conference. And the way to think about it is this. Why is agriculture such a challenge for the world's environment? Is it because farming is being done badly? No. The real issue is it is a huge challenge to feed 10 billion people. It's an even bigger challenge to feed 10 billion people the way we like to eat today. There is no way to do that except by being extraordinarily innovative in the way we're going to do agriculture. Now think about it, 30 years ago, we had no idea how we could solve the energy part of climate change. Solar cells were inefficient. The possibility of electric cars seemed remote. Wind power was inefficient. And governments spent a lot of money to help advance those technologies. With agriculture, we've barely started doing that. We need to be as innovative in promoting agricultural strategies that both produce more food in the same land, do it with fewer emissions, and reduce our demand for land-intensive foods. In the US, we have a test that you take to get into college. It's a multiple choice test, and you get to answer it A, B, C, or D. And D is usually all of the above. Like, is the answer A, B, and C? And in agriculture and food, it's all of the above. We need every creative solution we can think of. And so I'm just going to say that what I think, obviously there are huge conflicts right now in the food system in Europe. And I'm sympathetic with both sides. Because I think we need more food production in Europe, even animal products, but we also need all of these other solutions. And so I did a paper on how to make Danish agriculture carbon neutral, and what we recommended is what we call a social compact. And the social compact means more food production in Europe, but it also means restoring habitats, and it also means reducing emissions. And the deal needs to be that agriculture gets to go forward and produce more food while you're also doing these things as well. And to do that, from a policy perspective, and I'm basically done, First, we have to fix the carbon, what I call the carbon accounting, which is stop treating land as free. Land is not free. Land is unbelievably valuable stuff. You can't divert it to a new use except with a huge cost. And that has to be reflected in policy. There has to be a carbon cost assigned to the use of land. And then we have to devote a lot more resources to the innovation. So there are conferences like this occurring around the world today, and it's very exciting. And you're going to go through so many exciting things. But I was commenting with somebody beforehand, the ratio between action and resources and conferences about how to reform the food system is pretty low. We need to devote the resources to doing this right. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Timothy, and we'll have a chance to dig in a bit deeper in the panel session that you'll join later. But I would now like to pass the floor to the Flemish Minister for Economy, Innovation, Work, Social Economy and Agriculture, and that's Joe Brauns, for his opening speech. So the floor is yours.
Did they work? Hello? Yes. Good morning, dear Professor Serginger. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Professor, for replacing me for the opening. Actually, I'm happy that this logic of produce, protect, reduce, and restore is the opening idea of this 3 days conference, because on each of those elements, there are a lot of thoughts to be shared today. And as you know, the Flemish cow is the most climate-neutral cow of the world. We are here to step into a dialogue about our collective future, about what, in the end, matters most. From all over Europe, we are here united to talk about food. A gathering of 600 experts representing 43 different countries. We are, for sure, united in diversity. And in my humble opinion, Flanders is the very best place to talk about food. We meet in places where so many cultures have crossed over the past centuries, each leaving their influences. Flanders has always been known for its fertile grounds that bring forth so many delicious food and people that loves to enjoy good food. That goes well with a decent beer. But tradition, culture and landscape are certainly in the beautiful city of Leuven matched with expertise and knowledge. In 2025, the Leuven University will celebrate its 600th anniversary. Since the 1425 know-how about farming, environment and food have been gathered here. It's in this very place that we have to take stock of where we stand now. Never before has the future of food been so challenged. We face a crisis at many levels, and the symptoms should be clear by now. Farmers are marching our streets trying to protect their livelihoods. They fear to their future and the future of their farms. Parents are struggling to provide balanced meals for their families. Children too often arrive in schools without a lunch. Too much still nutritious food is not a given. Future generations fear that they will be confronted with the consequences of our unsustainable practices. Time after time, they ask us to make sure the future is secured and hopefully also prosperous. Next to that, Europe is at a challenging crossroad. Think about the ongoing war at our borders. We are trying to keep up in a changing global economic order, and besides that, we are facing a rapidly changing climate. These elements intensify the existing pressures on our food system and only increases our responsibility to deliver a fair, healthy, sustainable and resilient food system. That's why the coming 3 days are crucial. It is in times of big challenges that we need strategic choices that assure the future of our food systems. And the only sustainable way to make good strategic choices is through dialogue with all stakeholders, with experts, and with our feet on the ground. 4 years ago, the European Farm to Fork strategy was launched. 3 years ago, the United Nations launched its Food System Summit. And 2 years back, Flanders introduced its very first food strategy. Now it's time to take stock of where we stand. What have we already accomplished? Which recipes do we have to change? How can we move forward? Because only from that stock taking we can understand what's going well, but even more what's missing. Farmers wouldn't hit the streets, lunchboxes wouldn't remain empty, our youth wouldn't be fearful if all was going well. We will not get there unless we work together towards a common goal, following a common strategy, using a common compass. From a dialogue such as the strategic dialogue now happening at the European level, we need to end in a strategy that envisions a systemic approach. Why? Because food is central and touches much more than just eating 3 times a day. Such a strategy can never be made in an ivory tower buildings, but needs to be made with expertise, but even more with those people on the field, farmers, food processors and consumers. That's why our very own Flemish food strategy envisions healthy and sustainable food for all, within ecological borders, produced in a resilient and fair food economy, where farmers and citizens and all actors in between are reconnected with each other. That's why we in Flanders, together with a broad food coalition of stakeholders, developed a fruit strategy where everything comes together. This fruit strategy, despite many efforts, is still lacking at the European level. The challenges are large enough. The recent farmers' protests have only proven what we already knew. We need to act now. We need to work for a common strategy for the food of the future. Food unites us all. Food is what brings us together. Food is culture, heritage, and future. Food is the basis of our civilization. And because of that tremendous importance, we have a tremendous responsibility. The Open Food Conference is well timed. We have the European elections coming up in a time when the European Union is challenged for its strategic choices. Our government administrations have teamed up to assemble an impressive list of speakers in a 3-day conference that touches a very single part of the food system. The time is right to take up our responsibility. In the coming days, I count on each of you to create synergies between policies, science, industry, and practice in order to offer systemic response for our food challenges. Stakeholders of the very corner of the food system are part of this event, as a participant as well as a part in the organization of the conference, and I count on all of you to take up that responsibility. The responsibility to draft the sustainable future of our food systems lies in your hands. Take the coming days as a starting point for a common food strategy. Only together we will make this work. I count on you. Let us go for food. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that. And I would now like to open our first panel session of this event on the sustainable food systems, a general overview setting the scene, taking a wide-angle lens on the past few years, and offer viewpoints on how to best move forward in a systemic approach. And for this, I would like to invite to the stage Stefanos Fotiou, who is Director in the Office of Sustainable Development Goals for the UN's FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, also head of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Welcome. We also have with us today Dirk Jacobs, who is Director General of Food Drink Europe. We also have John Bell from the European Commission's DG for Research and Innovation. And Timothy is also kind enough to come and join this panel session as well. So welcome all of you. As you can see, I'm a little bit outnumbered, and we were hoping to also have Elizabeth Hayden with us, who is the Vice President of the EU Young Farmers Association, SEJA. She's also a dairy farmer herself. Unfortunately, her baby was taken ill over the weekend, so sadly she wasn't able to join us, but she has sent a video message for us. So I thought we'd kick off with that from the farmer's perspective and then move into the debate. So let's hear what Elizabeth has to say. Hopefully. I have to click something. Okay, let's have a look.
For the invitation for today's meeting. I'm sad I can't be with you, but anyway, thank you so much, and I'm very glad that I can share my message this way. I'm happy to be the voice of the few farmers of the future, the current young farmers. Young farmers will be the one who actually will implementing this future plans and goals we're setting up for the next 10, 20 and 30 years. Therefore, it's very important that we make sure that we have enough of farmers in the future food system. But the statistics are clear on this one. Only 6.5% of all the European farmers are under age of 35. And only 11.9% of the farm managers are below under age 40. And this is numbers from 2020. It's clear that not enough people seems to be able to farm. And we have some main problem when it comes to young people and farming. The first is access to land. And of course, land is one of the most important tools when it came to farming. The land prices are very high all over Europe. And a high level of land retirement by the older generation of farms which use their land as an alternative for a pension. Then we have the access to credit, and we know that young farmers are more likely to get their loan application rejected than other age categories. And we know that it's a very capital intensive sector. You need a lot of money to be able to start a farm. We also had a problem with knowledge and skills. In 2020, more than 72% of all the farmers still relying solely on practical experience on the farm without any specific agricultural education. And of course, it's not necessarily bad. It's very important with skills, practical skills. But we think that agricultural education and independent advisory service can also play a major role for the sustainable transition and the role for the farmers in the future. So we would like to fix this to have a future-proof and resilient food system. We need to bring the citizens on board also to reconnect the farmers and the citizens. And how do we do this? We need to decrease the knowledge about farming. And we need to decrease the gap between farmers and consumers. We have a lot of lack of knowledge from the consumer side, and also incorrect knowledge on the farmers and the sector as a whole. So the solution on this part could be that we need more education of food, and we need a more proactive sectoral communication strategy. Farmers should be at the forefront and play a more crucial role in education the consumers. We could have food programs in schools, for example. We also need a fair price for the transition. It needs to be sustainable. The sustainable transition is very important for young farmers. And however, we currently see that farmers all over Europe work with very small margins. We think that we can fix this, and it's vital if we want farmers to be able to achieve what they are able to actually achieve in the sustainable food system transition. So yes, farmers need more power, we need more money, we need more fairness, we need consumers to know more about what we are doing, and it needs to be easier to become a farmer. Thank you very much, and I hope that you have a lovely day. Bye.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, well, let's dive in now to the panel session, and let's have a general round. I mean, from the minister's remarks, from the first opening speech, it's clear that we will have to take stock of where we're at right now. And perhaps I'm going to go to Stefanos first, as we already heard from you, Tiffany. No offense to you. Stefanos, let's take a moment to take stock. From your viewpoint, where do you think we stand in building a European food policy? What is your view on where we're at right now?
I'm a little bit amused on this because I said I'm not really an expert on European policy, but if you want me to bring you a little bit of a global perspective on where we stand on this, I think that there's a big realization now that sustainable development cannot happen without changing the way that food systems are happening today. There are many experts that they say our food systems are failed. But I don't think they are failed. Actually, what they are doing is they are following market and price signals that they have been given to them. So we have the food systems today at the status that it was presented by Timothy, and I don't need to say anything more about this. It's a huge disaster because the market and the price signals that they were giving to them was in the wrong direction. So I think that the countries, and I think, of course, Europe has realized that we can't go forward with this. And it was indeed what the minister mentioned, the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021, that started to put the agenda of the food systems transformation at a much higher level from what it was before when we were talking about food and agriculture. So food systems today, there is a realization that it needs to be approached as a system, that it will have, of course, issues of agricultural production, but also health, environment, social protection. Do we see any progress? I think no, we don't see any progress, and I think there's not a single country or a single region in the world that it can claim that we have started making progress. There's some small steps, I can mention some of them in the next round, but I think what we urgently need is to change the fundamental causes of the problem, which is the price and the market signals and the way that these are given. And on this, there are two big problems, I think, and these are especially relevant to Europe. One is the bad subsidies. So it's the subsidies that we give to produce food that at the end it's making bad to the environment and to the health of the people. So we give subsidies that then we pay back on the basis of climate and health and social inequalities. And the second for me is the issue of the food production vis-a-vis what I will call the global food insecurity inequality that exists right now, because many countries are actually living on the expenses of other countries. I'm talking about developing countries mostly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and to secure food more, to have better food security in the industrialized world.
Okay, thank you for setting that kind of global perspective. Let's zoom in a little bit onto the EU now, passing to John. As this mandate comes to a close, I'm curious to hear what your view is on the legacy of the past few years, perhaps the legacy of the Farm to Fork strategy and where we stand now in building a European food policy. What are your views on that?
Thanks, Tash. I actually don't think that we've got time for pessimism. And I think I'm coming from the research and innovation corner, which is, of course, the longer lens, and is providing many of the solutions and the pathways. And a lot of us are wearing a T-shirt at the moment going, I told you so, because 10 years ago, when we started off talking about the need for a food systems approach, we were told there was no such thing as a food system. And here we are actually negotiating how do we move the food system forward. So I think there's a few things. So let's start here in Flanders. So Minister Bruins has been showing something which is not obvious, but leadership in terms of actually having a food system strategy. Baanbreken de voedselstrategie that we have here in Flanders. We have countries now that have actually realized you must put an integrated food system strategy at the center of how you think. This is the first step. If you look what the European Union has been doing for the last few years, whether you like it or not, it is the most fundamental overhaul of the rationale of what we do in the European Union across all of our policies and goals. we're putting this transformation on climate, on sustainability, on competitiveness at the centre of all of the legislation, all of the investment, all of the policies. You must spend a quarter of the budget, at least in current circumstances, on addressing these targets. So I think in the European Union sense, there's no lack of ambition, there's no lack of action, there's no lack of finance. We're even restructuring the taxonomies for the investments and what is acceptable. So the what is there, the question is how. So we're looking at a situation, particularly in the food system, and I think what's important of the food system, I think the food is, as the Minister is saying, it's our common language. It's the way in which we can actually understand a lot of these complex changes. It's a kind of a vernacular for everybody. And we've all become kind of disconnected from our food and from the different actors in the system. So this is a very good place for society to work out where we are in this transition journey. So the big question is, how do we get from where we are to meet our climate, our biodiversity, our water, our pollution, our waste, our sustainability, our just transition, our investment, the targets? There's 11 different fields of targets. How do we do it? And I think that's where knowledge and working with farmers, working with different communities and putting knowledge in the hands of people and finding new ways of accelerating the transition so that we don't just have transition by design, which is what we're faced with. We're in a decade in which we have to make fundamental shifts or the tipping points become irreversible, but we need transition by consent. And that means the kind of things we're doing in research and innovation in missions, where we're working with real laboratories in real places with farmers and with communities, with innovation in terms of deep tech, in terms of the centrality of our food industry, which is losing out in a way to some global competition. There's whole new areas of technology, of business models, of different ways of working that could transform the potential. And then in terms of the societal engagement, because we're not going to do this by different parts of society or different levels working in isolation. So I'll stop, Tasha, but I mean, in essence, research and science is there to give courage to politics, and it's there to give hope to citizens. It is there to give space to entrepreneurial innovation and respite to nature. And these things are there, they're on the legislative books. The question is, how are we going to do them? And that's the big step.
Okay, thank you. And Dirk, let me bring you in for your view on this point. Do you agree with John's assessment there? You know, he was talking about the what is there, but maybe not the how. How do you see the past few years and the legacy of what we've seen in this mandate?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to start on a positive note, because I think we are not sharing the story enough how since the 1960s, when the Common Agricultural Policy was introduced, we've had our agri-food systems in the EU have been able to deliver on quantity, on diversity of food to the majority of people here in Europe. So I think this is one point. Another one is that we've also been resilient as agri-food systems because, particularly in the last couple of years with all these crises, you haven't seen empty supermarket shelves, and I think that's also something that we need to give credit to. And we've also become the largest exporter of food and drink in the world, meaning also that we have built a reputation over those years in providing high-quality food. At least that's something that consumers all over the world want and need. So I'd like to start on that positive note, because there's quite a lot of negativity about food systems. You hear that food systems are broken, and of course, yes, there is a lot to do, but I think Europe can really lead also on that sustainability transition that is urgently needed. Now, I think we've had in that a lot of focus on agriculture and food and not so much on food systems, so I would definitely agree with the gentleman that that is an important step to make. And in that sense, it was brave for the European Commission to come with that farm-to-fork approach, which is basically the first step towards a common food policy. Now, has it been done in the right way? According to us, no. Sorry to say, people from the European Commission, and it's not only the European Commission, frankly, because it takes 3 to tango in the EU, or even 4 sometimes. But it has been too much a top-down exercise. It has not been co-created in terms of the vision, in terms of the implementation. We have not set out the pathway, and importantly, we have not set out the governance and the resourcing of it. There's zero money that has gone into farm to fork, and there was already a mention of the Common Agricultural Policy, where only a little bit is going to the transition. There needs to be discussion about that right now. The strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture in the EU, which hopefully is the strategic dialogue on the food systems future, that provides this opportunity for a common vision. And then you set a pathway, then you set the investments, then you set the plan how to get there. So it's very much about the how. I do agree with that. We are calling for an EU industrial plan for agri-food. We need more investment. And also at the global level, I think you can say that very little of the climate financing is going into agriculture and food. We see that here in Europe as well. We did a study that shows that only 35 billion euros will be needed in the first year for farmers to transition to more agricultural practices, sustainable agricultural practices. But we also need to speed up innovation. Other places in the world are going much faster than we are. We're importing foods and agricultural raw materials from, for instance, the US, where they do apply NGTs. Farmers can use those kind of technologies, but here we can't. So that makes us less competitive, less productive. But we also need to look at governance. We are calling for an executive vice president for food. This is something that we need because we do need to bring all the different parts together. That's the systemic approach for food systems that we are talking about. And we need better regulation, better looking at the figures behind the transition as well, doing impact assessments that are really showing the business case for that transition, which sometimes is absent right now.
Okay. Timothy, let me turn to you now. We're going to have to pass the microphone. Sorry, thank you. For your reflections on maybe what you've just heard there. We just heard from Dirk the idea of an industrial plan for agri-food sector. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And I'm also more broadly curious to hear what you think. I mean, we've faced back-to-back crises in the agri-food sector, not just in the EU, but globally over the past few years. And I mean, how do you see that we can adjust to these new developments while at the same time not losing the general direction of travel towards a systemic change that is needed?
Thanks. Well, first I want to agree that there is reason for optimism in the sense, first of all, the food system has been really good at producing a lot of food. So I agree with that last comment. I mean, you know, we produce a lot of food in the world. You can talk about health issues related to this and that, but my gosh, compared to the past and with 8 billion people, that's extraordinary. And I also agree that there are so many exciting ideas for how you could more sustainably produce food. And so lots of things the conference is going to explore. So if the world were really run right, could we feed 10 billion people well with dramatically reduced environmental impact? I have complete confidence that that is the case. So then the question is, how do you get there? So let me just add a little bit of a comment on how we do spend resources in the EU, for example. Well, when you really try to solve a problem, you direct a bunch of resources at good ideas in a coordinated way. You don't just hand out money to people to say, I'm going to do something good. You have ideas for how you're going to explore new innovative practices. You provide incentives for that, but you support it with R&D. Farmers would be working with researchers back and forth to explore ideas. And you can see in the best uses of common agricultural policy money, you can see projects where governments did this. They set up cooperative efforts between farmers and researchers to reduce, let's say, pesticide impacts or fertilizer use or things like that. So really billions of dollars, of that $94 billion, billions of those dollars need to be going toward those kinds of coordinated efforts. That's how you know if people are serious, because that's what everybody does to solve any problem if you're taking it seriously. If you just have a formula for handing out money based on X, Y, or Z that isn't a part of a coordinated project, it's not serious. So that's the test, right? Is the money being spent in that way? And then the second is the objective. So where I think, well, Farm to Fork had a lot of great ambitions, what it was missing was a sense of the need to produce more food. And that is because it didn't focus on the fundamental land use challenge globally, which is that if you don't produce food in Europe, you're going to produce it somewhere else. And so we need to do both. And that has, again, to do with this accounting issue. So I have a phrase which is, if you want to do a little bad, try really hard to do something bad yourself. if you want to do a lot of bad, create a wrong accounting rule, because then everybody will do bad things. So if we have accounting rules that say, I can divert food production to something else, and there's no climate cost, or when I look at dietary shift, there's no climate benefit from the reduced land use, then people aren't going to do the right thing. So I'll end with this. This is an example, because a lot of people, I think, recognize the importance of plant-based alternatives. Now, if you compare the emissions of producing chicken versus the emissions of producing a plant-based chicken product, and you don't count land use, you'll find out that the plant-based chicken product has more emissions, more energy. Where are the savings? It's in the land. It reduces the amount of land that you need. If you don't count that as a greenhouse gas benefit by reducing the amount of land you need, you won't do it. You'll do the opposite. It's the same, it's the inverse of the policy that has led us to having this huge amounts of biofuels. So it is absolutely critical that the amount of land that you use be counted in greenhouse gas terms, or we will do the wrong thing. So I would say those are the two key things. Spend money in coordinated ways and all of the great ideas that are going to come out in this conference, and get the accounting right for land.
The devil is in the details, right? Thank you. You're going to have to pass that along. Thank you. Yeah, Stefanos, let me come to you now. In your opening remarks, you were talking about the need for this systemic approach, and you said you had some ideas of the ingredients that was needed to make this recipe, the fundamental shift. So in your view, what is that? What is that's needed to move towards this fundamental shift, systemic approach in agri-food systems?
I think I'll take the lead from Timothy about the accounting. There was a recent report from FAO on the state of agriculture that focused on what is called the hidden cost of food. And the figure is a tremendous figure, so it's estimated that the negative externalities of food in terms of environmental, social, and even economic issues is about 12.7 trillion, and I say trillion US dollars equivalent at PPP. And here I want to make a comment about celebrating the food production. I think we can celebrate the increase in the volume of the food production, but we can't celebrate how this has happened. It has happened at the expenses of the environment, of societies. And I would even say that if we celebrate the food production of a specific region, we need to see what was the impact of this region in other ones. Timothy talked about the outsourcing, which is a great source of this externality. So we might feel proud, some countries might feel proud that they have reduced probably their own carbon emission, but they have done this at the expenses of other countries. So what I think it needs to be done, many things, but I would talk about three, first of all. One is to start internalizing the true cost of food in the accounting when it comes to whatever has to do with food. Is it about investment plans? Is it about policies? We need to take into account this hidden cost of food. So we cannot say that we should plan investments only with the only objective of increasing the production. We need to see this hidden cost of food. And there are methodologies today that can be done. And FAO actually, in the next version of the study, will go from the global level down to regional and country level. So it can be done. And this is number one. The second, for me, we will need to start thinking of a much better regulatory environment when it comes to many food products out there. I'll make a statement that I've made it many times, and then people attack me, and they come to the coffee break, and they told me you should have never told this, but I will say it. About 35 to 40 years ago, there was a realization that the tobacco industry was killing people. And the governments, they say this killing should stop, and they took a number of measures to curb the consumption of tobacco products. Yeah? And according to the World Health Organization, this fight have some successes. Yeah, less people are smoking. We have less cancers per amount of population, breast cancers. There is some food, not all food, there's some food out there that needs to be treated like tobacco and needs to be regulated the way tobacco products they were regulated, because this food is killing people. And if we avoid identifying the food that in purpose is killing people, I think we cannot talk about a big part, which is the healthy diets. The third for me will be to understand the level of accountability and responsibility between the different actors of the value chain. Mm-hmm. Why the farmers are in the streets in Europe? Because I think we have dropped to them all the negative externalities that other actors have put in the food systems. Mm. So if we see the value chains of very big commodities, there is also a big study that's saying that why the farmers are producing indeed most of the food, they get a very small amount of the added value. Why? Because the largest amount of the added value in the food value chains is going to the process, distribution, and marketing. Hmm. But actually we're asking the farmers to pay the bill. No, it's unfair. So to summarize, take your prices right, address the bad that some bad food is doing, and have a much better justice in the value chains, asking the ones that they are creating the problem to pay the price, and not the ones that they are forced sometimes, because many European farmers are forced to produce something that they don't want just because to get the subsidy. So that would be, for me, 3 starting points. Mm.
Okay, John, on the point there of, okay. Sounds like you might have an okay coffee break this time. It might be all right for you. Thank you for that. John, let me come to you now. I mean, we're talking here about tackling these systemic issues that so often are crossing policy levels and domains and borders, things like here we've spoken about food prices or trade that, require this answer at, a higher level, more umbrella level. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how can we tackle that, and maybe within the Commission. I mean, we have spoken, Dirk mentioned, the structuring of the Commission. Is the current structure of the Commission's DG set out for the job? There's discussions on the EVP of food. Any thoughts on the reorganization of this to move towards more of a food systems thinking in policy approaches?
Thanks. Well, I think first is to talk about what's actually happening. All of us have, it's easy to say what should happen, but what's actually happening, if you look at, for example, the issues of climate and agriculture and land use change, there are laws now in place. Member states have to report in what used to be called the effort sharing side of things, so non-energy, non-transport. Every member state has to come up with a climate action plan. Every member state has to meet specific sectoral targets, including in agriculture, land use, and land use change. These things are all done. They're all in law. That's not the issue. The issue is how do we get there? And how do we get there with different levels of division, a lot of it which is being driven by different interests, not looking at some of the outcomes that are there. So what we're trying to do in research innovation, so the first thing about research innovation is to say what we do. We are no longer observers in the process, we are actors in the process. So a lot of what has been said here, we are doing. So first of all, you need to have different pathways to develop the food systems. We've been talking about food systems for 10 years, and we have been actively developing food systems research and innovation for the UN Food Systems Summit in the work that we do globally, because again, as what you're saying, Stefan, is very important. We have an obligation to make what we have available as quickly as possible and put the knowledge in the hands of our partners and work with them in different places in the world. We have developed 11 pathways, specific innovation pathways, not rhetoric, but actual investment. We're spending about 95 billion euros in Horizon Europe, around 9 billion of which is in this area of bioeconomy, food, and so forth. The 11 pathways of Food 2030, I think about 700 million euros has been spent to actually develop the solutions and the science on actual alternative crops, proteins, the development of microbiomes, sustainable aquaculture, the food safety systems of the future, sustainable nutrition and diets. You know, there's 11 areas in which we're actively working on that. We've developed a huge partnership with our member states, which is how we work in the European Union, about 500 million euros starting later this year on how we're going to work together with all of the different research and innovation systems to develop solutions and knowledge and so forth. There's a new approach that's necessary in terms of the fragmentation. I mean, we have a very specific problem in time. There's a lot of things that need to be done because of the planetary context, the tipping points, the resources. I mean, we haven't even mentioned water here. You can solve the carbon problem. In some parts of Europe, you go to a plant-based agriculture and you have a water problem. So we have to also find different ways of doing different things. So we have a new mission-based approach. So Timothy, one of the things it was a really brilliant and interesting presentation. We need, like what you did in the States for getting to the moon and back in some of these areas. So we've launched these 4 Green Deal missions. One of them is the restoration of 75% of the soil in Europe by the end of the decade. And that is working through 100 laboratories that are local, living labs, working with farming communities, science communities, building the bridges between communities, and working the specific circumstances to actually restore the soil, not to talk about it, but to actually do it. We're doing the same in the oceans and waters. One of the assumptions we don't have is we don't need the land for the food, always. We've also got the 70% of the planet that is water-based. We need to bring that side in. It's much more important as well in some of our less developed countries. So we have a restoration of the water and the soil system as another mission. A climate adaptation mission, which is about 150 resilient regions. Resilience is going to be the common language of the next decade. Most of our assumptions about water, about heat, about temperature, about invasive species, about crop, about everything else are going to be challenged, including in the European Union in the next few years. So how do we get to resilience and mainstream that? We're doing that again at scale in 150 regions where bring the knowledge, develop the innovation, connect in a co-created way the work that you used with communities. So research, innovation, and policy has to follow. We have to work in new ways. It's great that we have all this regulation. The nature restoration law, I think, was one of the most interesting examples of people say, well, you shouldn't do it top-down, you should do it bottom. You know, regulation and decisions sometimes mean there are differences of opinion. The nature restoration law, which is probably the most critical actually probably for farming and for rural communities in the long term, was seen as a challenge for farming in different places because of the nature of things. So making the legislation means that you then have to put in place a different way of delivery. So on these other points, how do we organize ourselves? I mean, it's quite clear we can no longer go on in this period of deployment with simply saying we have all these policies and legislation. So one of the areas I'm responsible for is the bioeconomy. You need to have enabling policies that, for example, the point you made about biofuels is a very important point. There's a period in which the incentives for biofuels are there until they get to the next generation of different sources of energy and so forth. But there's a biomass gap. There's questions that you need to ask in terms of why do we do this rather than that. So we will be developing the next generation of bioeconomy policies where you can have trade-offs between food, energy, water, environment. But it means a few things. It means in governance terms, you need completely different ways of working. So you need to work across disciplines, if you're in universities, across government departments, which is extremely difficult to do, but it's something we're actually getting quite good at inside the Commission and in other member states and in places like Flanders where they've had to do this. Between public and private actors, between stakeholders who are very often divided, between the rural and urban economies, between levels of government and between national and international partners. So it means a system shift in terms of the way we actually do things as well. And that's another part of what we're trying to do in research and innovation is to use these, we call them living labs or lighthouses in different cases, to work out how do we do the governance in a situation where we're running out of time, but we're not running out of ideas. So it's a whole shift. And whether having a vice president for the food system, I think the idea that food comes back, food, which is central, which includes agriculture, rural communities, the bioeconomy, safety, and all of the other things, whether it comes back politically and is visible to people there who are so concerned about the changes they're being asked to make, I think is an interesting idea. I think there's a way in which some of these missions could become actually EU-level missions rather than research and innovation. I think a lot of the things that are needed in terms of the signals to the investment banks, the renewal funds, the different kinds of de-risking are there. They may need to be coordinated at a different level. And last but not least, on innovation, we have the knowledge and innovation communities on food. We have the European Innovation Council. We have innovation financing in the EIB. And within the CAP, it's not that within the CAP there's a prohibition on doing anything positive in the CAP, which is what you start to hear. You know, the CAP is designed with national plans. It's designed with farmers. We have thousands in these innovation communities called the Innovation Partnerships for Agriculture. We have a knowledge systems called ACCUS, which is all in place. Farming and farming communities exist now. Yep. We're talking about a transition to something that happens next. And the difficulty, because the Common Agricultural Policy is not invented here, it's invented and created and co-created by communities at places and times. So the question is to get the next one to do more of what it's able to do, but that farmers can live with in terms of the way in which rural regeneration is the goal. That's the challenge, but that's a very difficult challenge.
All right, okay, thank you for that. And I'm glad you picked up the point about the EVP. I was going to pick you up on that, but you went for it, so thank you. Dirk, let me come to you now. Stefanos was talking about this need to shift the power to the different actors of the food chain. Obviously, a core part of the farmers' protest is all about the pricing. How do we ensure a fair sharing of this burden of these sustainability efforts throughout the supply chain? And how can we kind of focus discussions on that? What policy tools do we have at our disposal?
Well, I think it starts with taking a systemic approach. A systemic approach means coordination and collaboration, and that means also risk sharing in the chain. Farmers, of course, deserve a good price for what they produce, and they also are confronted with additional investments that are needed for the transition. That all needs to be catered for, and farmers, or not any other actor in the chain singly, should be picking up that bill, and this is something that has to be worked out. What I don't think, and that's where I maybe disagree with a colleague from FAO, I don't think that a divide and conquer strategy works. So if policymakers would say, let's regulate one part of the chain so that we then solve all the problems for the rest, I don't think that that is the solution, a structural solution. Rather, we need to strengthen the entire food chain, and we need to also look at what that means for consumers. And you were talking about internalizing the externalities, the true cost of food. It's a very unpopular discussion to have, but do consumers need to also be part of that transition and pay a little bit more for the food and drinks they are consuming? This is terribly complicated, terribly complex, but it is something that we sooner rather than later need to address. And in that regard, I think sometimes policy, and that's what I see at least at the European level, is a bit contradictory, because we are asked to invest, and we producers, from farmers, processors, retailers, traders, we're asked to invest into the transition. We know that it is going to cost a lot of money, but then competition policy in the EU says that we should aim for the cheapest possible price. So there's a disconnect between what we have to do and what policy is actually prescribing and setting us to do. Same with collaboration in the chain. There are all kinds of barriers and hurdles for farmers, processors, and so forth to collaborate, even though that could actually lead to more efficiencies, more cost efficiencies, more innovations that could be applied across the chain that are not possible today. And there are some steps being taken. Luckily, the European Commission has recently adopted a proposal that allows for sustainability agreements to be made under competition rules. That's already a step, but there are some contradictory signals that we're getting. And in fact, in general, farmers, companies are getting contradictory signals that need to be about what they need to do, what they need to say, what they need to produce, that needs to be addressed. Lastly, maybe to the point on bad foods or whatever that was, we produce food that is safe, that is compliant with legislation. If not, we should not have that on the market, and we're doing illegal stuff. So it's up to governments, authorities to determine what that is then if they think that there is a bad food out there. But I don't think that, again, in the wider scheme of things, that narrative helps us, and particularly not comparing that to tobacco, which I think is ludicrous suggestion. That also doesn't help to create a better narrative about the value that farmers, that processors, that retailers, etc., provide to providing food and drinks on our table. So I hope that we can shift away from that kind of negative narrative into a much more positive narrative on how can we make sure that in 2050 we have sufficient food for everyone of nutritious quality, with the least possible resources, and indeed with the least possible impact on the planet and on people. So that's, I think, a challenge that we all are facing. If we can maybe for once shift that narrative to a bit more of a positive can-do narrative rather than getting stuck into blaming one or the other, I think then we come already a little further into that conversation.
Okay, sounds like discussions will continue past this past this panel afterwards. But let me stay on the theme of consumers for now, because I mean it's clear from all the interventions consumers play such a key part of the transition. I'm going to have to ask you to pass the microphone back. Yeah, thank you. Timothy, let me come to you. I mean, it's clear that we need to bring citizens on board, but how do you see that we can do that? How we can bring consumers on board? Elizabeth mentioned it also in her opening remarks. You know, maybe there's a gap between consumers and the farm, a lack of knowledge. How can we bring them on board with this transition? Big question.
Right. So there's kind of a divide in the world of people trying to use consumer purchasing to change agriculture, between those who think somehow or other we can just kind of educate consumers and persuade them to demand things differently, and those who think you just have to essentially provide something that they want at the right price. So this is particularly with regard to, let's say, plant-based meats or alternative proteins, right? So in general, we have yet, with limited exceptions, we have yet to provide alternative proteins that that taste the same or as good or better. I think the exceptions are, the one exception actually in the US for meat was the Impossible Burger, which pretty much comes close, and then dairy for milk, obviously. The new generation seems perfectly happy with alternatives. But they're not cheaper. So you know, the Good Food Institute, which is kind of the kind of leading organization on plant-based, we have to just put money into producing cheaper, better tasting alternative proteins. And I'm kind of in that camp. You know, basically, there's very little evidence, for example, that diet recommendations by governments influence behavior hardly at all. So I'm generally in the, we got to meet the consumers where they want, and therefore we got to produce the things that are better for them. So I would basically put that in the camp. Having said that, at the risk of we call beating a dead horse in the U.S., we do want people to recognize what's beneficial, and I do think that this idea that you just want to reduce the amount of land that is used to produce your products is a critical concept. And that isn't there, right? Everyone's focused, let's say, only on organic or pesticides, right? What about reducing the amount of land use? And I think this is, and for example, I think the comment about EU policy has got all kinds of great stuff and mandates to national governments to achieve to make progress in climate targets. What isn't there is stop outsourcing, right? So I keep coming back to that the number one problem with our food system, with all the other challenges, and it's not because farmers are bad, it's just because it's really hard to feed 10 billion people, is we use the vast majority of the plant growth on the planet to feed people. I mean, there's only so much potential to grow plants on the planet, and we use most of that to feed people, right? So we have diverted it from using all the other purposes of nature instead to doing it to feed people. And that's a huge challenge. And therefore, the number one thing we have to do is to hold that down. And so that, I think, is an ethic that has to be reflected in consumer understanding and in governments.
And for our last note, I'll pass the floor to Stefanos. On the same point there, or how you bring consumers on board for this transition, what are your reflections on that, and how can we bridge this gap between consumers and farming and the farm system?
I think you need to really put things on an equal level for everybody. So for the consumers to understand what is their impact and what is their opportunity of change. Let's take the meat consumption. Yeah? I think, Timothy, you saw in Europe about 80 kilograms per person per year, something like this. Yeah. So what we know is that there are some people in the world that they overconsume meat, and some others that they need much more meat, yeah, because they cannot cover their protein needs. Okay, so it's what I call part of the injustice in food security. So this will be changed the moment that somebody will understand where its consumption habits are causing first an impact to itself, because we have the national healthy dietary standards, yeah? And every one of us, it can project its menu vis-a-vis these national healthy dietary standards, correct? So we do know where is our overconsumption. And this will do a great benefit to ourselves. Yeah? I'm talking as someone that I've done this 35 years ago. Now, I don't want to name and shame, so I will name and shame myself. I was 120 kilos, 35 years ago. And what was the impact? Of course, in my health. So I projected my diet to the national healthy standards, and I found where was my problem. But the second level for me, for the consumer, is to understand that many times the consumption habits are not demand-based, but are supply-shaped. So it is the marketing that make us consume some things because we feel that we are part of a culture that it's the privileged one. There was an extremely famous French economist, Veblen, in the beginning of the 20th century, which said, and I see some young people in the audience making something like this, so you know Veblen, and that's amazing. So Veblen says, I consume, therefore I exist. So consumption is an act of identity and not only an act of surviving. So what the marketing is doing is making you to adopt an identity through your consumption styles that it will make you, for example, think that you might be like Messi. You saw Messi there, yeah? I love him. When you consume a specific product that it's advertised by him. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, you can all get applause now because I have to bring this sadly to a close because we've run out of time. So perhaps everyone, a round of applause for all of our panelists there. And now no one's left out. So thank you very much. Thank you. That brings this this first part of this event to a close. Thank you to all of our speakers. Of course, that was quite a whistle-stop tour of all the key themes, huge topics. We've only scratched the surface. But the good news is that we've got the next few days to dig in even deeper. So thank you very much. Enjoy your coffee break. And I'll see you after the break. Thank you.